Hello, and welcome to Instant Insights, Global Data's strategic intelligence podcast. At Global Data Strategic Intelligence, we track over 100 tech, industry, ESG, and macro themes impacting all major sectors. I'm Stu Robarts, and in today's episode, we're discussing social media abuse in sport. The topic has been back in the news after British tennis player Katie Boulter revealed threats to her and her family sent during matches at this year's French Open. But it isn't a new issue. Abuse directed at sports people via social media has been on the rise for years, to the point where Boulter says it is now the norm. To help understand the extent of the issue, what can be done about it, and the role social media platforms themselves have to play, I'm speaking to Jonathan Sebire, co-founder of data science firm Signify, which uses artificial intelligence to investigate and tackle online threats, abuse, and disinformation. Signify's threat matrix is used by partners like the Women's Tennis Association, the Professional Footballers Association, and the National Collegiate Athletic Association in the US to monitor abuse and identify those behind it so that it doesn't go unpunished. Jonathan, thanks for joining us. I wonder if you could begin today by outlining the extent of abuse on social media.
Thank you, Stu. Unfortunately, it is not ubiquitous, but I would say that there is no one, whether it's an individual sports person or whether it's a team, a member of a sports team, or indeed officials, so match officials, referees, etc., or other stakeholders kind of involved in and around sport. No one is immune because we've worked on projects where all of those kind of groups have been targeted in some way. Um, what I would say is that there are particular groups, there are particular issues within each sport that tend to be targeted most prevalently, depending on the individual sport. But we've worked across global football, we've worked across global tennis, we've worked on, some of the largest events in the world. We've worked across athletics, worked across rugby, even ice hockey and badminton and other kind of sports that people might not necessarily think would make the headlines. And in each of those, the issue is there, it just manifests itself in a different way. And what's, I think, the most important thing, and I'll probably repeat this throughout the interview, is the impact of that that we do have data for and that we do see, and the reason that this is something that shouldn't just be dismissed is that ultimately it does have an impact on people competing, and it does therefore have an impact on performance. So there are two sides to it. One is well-being in terms of the people being targeted, but that well-being does impact performance, and ultimately in elite sport, performance is kind of the tip of the spear in terms of what everyone is looking to deal with.
So, just to elaborate on what you picked up on there, what types of abuse do you see the most of? And do you have a sense of what motivates individuals to send abuse?
Yeah, so we do look at the different typologies of abuse. So the different types of abuse that are being targeted at people, and it's everything from, there will be racist abuse, there will be violent threats, so death threats, threat to family, threat to loved ones. There will be homophobic abuse, but there are different types of abuse and problematic behavior that in and of themselves may seem benign, but actually have a massive impact. So we do a lot of work around fixated threat, which is where somebody is developing a fixation or an obsession with somebody. So we deal a lot with situations that develop into stalkers, into people kind of harassing people on the long term. And a lot of that content initially is not problematic in and of itself. So how you detect it, what you're looking for, and the kind of behavior patterns that you're looking for as to when does that actually become a risk where you have to have an intervention, is something that we deal with a lot. And there are variations by gender in terms of what kind of abuse is targeted. There are variations by sport. And in terms of the motivations, there are various motivations. There are, with the fixations, we do have people who just become obsessed with sports stars or sports people because of their profile, and that's something that unfortunately is not unique to sport, but comes with that kind of territory. But we also see a lot, and certainly in kind of some recent studies that we've put out, the majority of abuse has been triggered in relation to gambling and some of the impacts on that. And even within that, there are multiple kind of motivations for that. You see some people reacting to having lost money, but you also now see we have data looking at people who are trying to influence outcomes. So people who are targeting people prior to performance in order to kind of have some impact on the way that a particular match or fixture is going to go.
And you mentioned just earlier about the differences you see. To what extent do you see those differences between certain sports, leagues, teams, or individuals being targeted?
It's interesting. So you will have differences in terms of how people are targeted. So for example, there's also a certain type of abuse can have a very different impact depending on the reality of the sport. So we take something like homophobic abuse that is being targeted at people. If you look at elite football, certainly in the UK, if there is a lot of homophobic language that is targeted at male players, and there is definitely an intent the intent is that the people sending that think that's the worst thing they can say to someone, to use homophobic language towards them. But the person receiving it, certainly in the Premier League, there are no openly gay players. So it's a type of abuse that is something that doesn't have you don't know if it's having the bite that it would have if you're targeting against certainly in the WSL with the women's team, which is a different situation where you have homophobic abuse targeting those players, but some of them are in fact openly gay, and in fact some of them are in relationships with each other. So you have a very different dynamic in terms of how that abuse kind of manifests itself. I think another, in terms of violence, I think there's an almost universal trend where you're targeting male players in a particular sport. Violence, yes, does target them, but again, there is a perception that they are more vulnerable through their loved ones. So actually, often you'll have violence targeting partners, targeting children, targeting parents and family. And in football, we definitely see that because there is a trend, particularly when clubs or international duty players are playing overseas. Violence tends to be don't come back to this country, don't come back to this city, we will find your family, that kind of thing that kind of manifests itself. With female kind of players and targeting women's sport, there is a more sexualized dynamic to that kind of violence, which maybe kind of as you anticipate, and the threats of sexual violence are more prevalent kind of in that sort of realm. There is no particular difference in terms of how individuals are targeted. So someone in an individual sport like athletics, like golf, will be targeted in the same way that an individual football player might be targeted. It's just that the dynamic is different because with the trigger, maybe the team's performance as opposed to their own performance, but they also have a team infrastructure around them, as opposed to a lot of people we see in individual sports don't necessarily have that support network around them. So that's what we're trying to work with governing bodies, with leagues, with structures around them to try and help them get the same infrastructure and support around them that somebody has in a club dynamic. One final point on that: the only thing that a team dynamic can give you, which is something that we kind of look at as well, is there can be an element of shame in talking about the impact that this kind of abuse has on you. Which is why we've seen very senior footballers like Granit Xhaka from Arsenal spoke out very publicly about he'd had a period of poor play, and at the end of that he talked about the fact that his wife had been being threatened online consistently and in a very serious manner, and that had had an impact on him and kind of had an impact on his performance. And we see other elements of that. Unfortunately, one of the rising kind of categories that we see at the moment is young players, young sports people being targeted, particularly with sextortion scams. So, and these are people who are not kind of at the elite level. So they're not incredibly wealthy, but they are in academy structures. They are coming up. People know that they have a little bit of money and a little bit of profile, and they're at the beginning of their career. And so they would maybe feel vulnerable to having that career threatened. And we see a rising trend of them being essentially honey trapped into sharing images or sharing information and then being blackmailed over those. and have worked with some, there are some very good education programs, and we've spoken to lots of clubs and different bodies about this in terms of educating players that there's nothing shameful about speaking up about that, and it's not a problem they have to suffer with alone, because we can deal with it and we can help to stop the people who are doing that. But that's another kind of rising area that we're dealing with at the moment.
This sort of abuse can have such a big impact on the individuals to which it is targeted. From Signify's perspective, with the experience and expertise and research you guys have done and the knowledge you have, what needs to be done to tackle social media abuse in sports?
So I think the first thing to say is that there is often a little bit of a blame game and a little bit of finger pointing in terms of, well, this should be done by regulation, this should be done by the platforms, this should be done by the gambling industry if it's abuse is being triggered by angry gamblers. Um, the reality is that there is no one single party who can actually solve this, or is going to solve it if you look at it in a realistic manner, in terms of how those organizations interact with each other. Um, so if you start with the platforms do have and have moved into a space of having some provisions to help with certain types of material, to set up your accounts in a way where some of that material will not get through to you, or they've made kind of reporting lines easier. The real difficulty with social media platforms is, if you're an elite sports person, if you're a high profile sports person, then you don't have the time to do that. And also, if you're doing that, you are having to engage with the material that's being sent to you. So the impact of that material is there anyway. You're being traumatized with it. And by being made to go through the reporting process or to deal with it yourself, you are being re-traumatized. So the impact is twice as deep. So if something's really upset you and you have to go back in and deal with that and to deal with platforms, then that's a problem. It's also true that individual abusers will be probably trying to target you across multiple platforms. So dealing with a problem on X would leave you exposed on TikTok, would leave you exposed on Meta platforms. Dealing with something on Meta platforms, equally, someone might go to X or TikTok or vice versa. So the platform issue is not simple. There are tools, and we instruct people on how to use those tools to the best of their advantage. But there's always going to be a space for people to help you deal with the scale of that, and to also deal with it on your behalf, so that you're not being re-traumatized in terms of how you deal with that. Regulation is another aspect that allows pressure to be brought onto social media companies in terms of what they deal with, but it's not a silver bullet, it's not a panacea, because if we're dealing with a sport like tennis, or we're dealing with football, then these are international sports now. You have people traveling overseas all the time to different jurisdictions, different regulatory jurisdictions. And so regulation is helpful, and it gives a framework for you to understand what the platform should be doing. But there's always going to be a gap where you need a safety net for that stuff's going to get through and pick up. And then in terms of governing bodies and people who have duty of care over these athletes, the real responsibility they have there is to help implement measures where they're recognizing the impact of this, and helping to implement that in a way that has the least impact possible on the athletes, and so it has the least possible impact on performance and well-being. And there are a number of companies who kind of operate in this area. We believe we're fairly unique in the fact that we offer multiple elements in terms of how you deal with this. But there are lots of different providers, and using companies, third-party companies outside of the platforms, regulators and gambling companies, is always going to be part of the picture, just because of the way that this manifests over various different platforms and various different mediums. In terms of the gambling industry and the gaming companies, they all have existing responsible gambling laws in most major jurisdictions. Again, you have a jurisdictional problem because some sit outside that, and that's going to always be problematic. But those companies and the industry as a whole, dealing where really problematic, really prolific abusers are identified, or where people are trying to manipulate fixtures with the abuse that they are sending for a gambling outcome, then there are already provisions for excluding people from platforms, for banning people from accounts, and that's just something that should be enforced and it should be part of this process in terms of how you work with the gambling companies themselves. But it's the willingness to do that and the conversations to do that. They need to be having quite an open area because there are a lot of people on the sporting side who are obviously getting revenue and taking sponsorship and taking money from those companies. So it has to be, it's not just a you're causing the problem, you're causing the abuse, we're going to shut you down. It's not realistic. You have to find a way to deal with the people who are actually problematic in terms of how you either remove them from the platforms or you educate them. And again, you come up against jurisdictional variations, so that has to be thought about on a global scale for most sports as opposed to local.
And just on that note, how successfully do you think we are at the moment bringing perpetrators to account, if you like? And do you feel we're making progress on that front?
Yeah, I do. So one of the main things that we are looking to do is to help people understand where this abuse is coming from, why it's being sent to them, but also who's sending it, and what does that mean in terms of decisions you can make off the back of that. So um, obviously at the very sharp end, there's a legal course of action that people might want to take. If someone is sending death threats to you and they happen to, they're living in the same city as you or in the same country as you, then there's a tangible threat, then that's something that will go into a legal process. But below that, there's lots of different kind of choices in terms of what action, whether it's a club or a league or an individual can take. And those might, if you find that somebody who is sending horrific racist abuse to a player is actually also a season ticket holder of your club or someone who has regular physical access to that player, then you can take away that membership, you can suspend it, you can do ticket exclusions, you can take that kind of action as a club or a league. There are kind of education processes. So unfortunately, sometimes we see young people who are using language or using things that they understand that that this causes hurt, that this has an impact, but they don't necessarily understand why and why they're actually using this language. And if you think about a football club, for example, they might have a 60, 70-year relationship with somebody who's in their teens at the moment, and they don't necessarily want to cut that off at the root. So there can be an education process about, we as a club have certain values and this behavior doesn't fit with those values. So you have a choice to make. Do you want to be engaged with the club and understand why you shouldn't be engaging in this behavior? And if you do that, then we'll have a good relationship for those 60, 70 years. Or if you say, no, this is something I really strongly believe, then we're going to sever those ties with you. And that's, from a business point of view, clubs, leagues, governing bodies have the power to do that, and that is actually something that we've seen a number of parties engage with in a really successful way. We've worked with a number of clients over kind of 3 or 4 years now, and you can see that where they do that, where they engage with fans in that way, and fans know if you engage in this kind of behavior, if you are threatening your own kind of athletes, your own sports people, players, you are kind of sending them, aggravated racial abuse on a regular basis, then you may find that access is taken away for you, and and over a period of time, you can see that for people who have that relationship, the level of abuse does go down significantly, and it is a deterrent that works in terms of engaging with in those kind of ways.
Mhm. Just before we finish, last one. From Signify's perspective, through the work you guys do and perhaps the research you do, is there anything you think we haven't touched on that's worth mentioning or that you guys see that perhaps isn't discussed in a wider forum?
Yeah, that's a good question. We've been working in this really properly since 2019. A little bit of a hiccup at the beginning of the pandemic, but ironically, because sport went behind closed doors and everyone was online, it was actually a really good time to kind of start thinking about this because you just saw a lot of fan behavior online. But we've been doing this for a relatively long time now. But the industry itself, in terms of how clubs, leagues, governing bodies think about this, is still relatively nascent. Is it a welfare issue? Is it a security issue? Is it a comms issue? Where does this actually sit? And the answer is that really it sits across all of those and more. But ultimately, online abuse becomes a performance issue, and that's the most kind of important thing that I think clubs and leagues and governing bodies should be thinking about in terms of how they do it. But it is becoming a much more sophisticated industry. It's becoming something that people understand more. They understand the downside, the risk, the fact that it does cost championships, it costs medals, it costs games, and but it's not something that you just have to ignore. Um, how those with the duty of care speak to players about this is something that is also evolving and getting better. But helping players to understand and translate that, helping agents and teams around them and coaches understand how they do that is something that is also an ongoing process and is getting better, but it's something that's developing and needs to be developed further. But I think the two main takeaways are it's a performance issue. No single party will ever really be able to deal with this, particularly because of the evolution that we've seen. One thing we haven't touched on is the injection of AI manipulated sound and imagery into this, which is a massive thing. We've seen a lot of accounts that started parody accounts that are genuine, are set up to do genuine parodies. So you may have seen fake press conferences where people say outrageous things that they would never say. Obviously, satire, the accounts are set up as satire, it's funny, but equally, there is now a second wave of those kind of fake press conference videos and other imagery that is not presented in that way. It's presented as fact, it's presented, and that is something that's a coming wave as well in terms of how do you, as an athlete at the sharp end, or as a club, a league, someone has a duty of care, how do you ensure that people know what is real and isn't real in terms of how you present yourselves? That's going to be a massive issue over the next kind of 12 to 36 months. But this will impact your performance. There's no one party that can actually deal with it alone. So you need to think about who you work with and how they can help you deal with this across the whole gamut of things you have to consider. And the final thing is, you don't have to suffer in silence with it if you're an athlete, because there are steps you can take and you can mitigate it. And we have data over the course of those 5 to 6 years that really clearly shows that different interventions can help reduce the amount of abuse that you're suffering and mitigate it from certain fan sections completely in terms of how you're engaging with them. So those are the three things.
Jonathan, thanks so much for joining us. It's not a particularly pleasant topic to have to discuss, but it's fascinating hearing your insights because you guys do some really interesting work.
Thank you very much. Cheers to you.
Thanks to Jonathan for providing those instant insights, and thanks to you all for listening. From us at Global Data Strategic Intelligence, see you next time.